Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. What does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Our last several episodes have been circling around the theme of relationship and connection. So this week, we're continuing the conversation by sharing our thoughts on what we could call the love language of interest in another person. We've noticed personally that what truly bonds us to others and lets us feel loved is presence, represented in the form of interest and curiosity. Yet, our cultural and familial models are often missing this key ingredient. In this talk, we cover a tangible way to look at if you're present, how ego agendas can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, ways to experience genuine connection, and how the conversation of doing versus being can also apply to the way we communicate. If you're enjoying the show, there's a few ways you can help support us over here at Bliss and Grit. We'd love if you leave a review on iTunes. What this does is it helps more people find us, and it feels great to read. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to get our weekly digest or find out more about becoming one of our supporting members on Patreon. We've chosen not to have advertisers on the show for now, so becoming a patron is the way to help us keep providing these beautiful episodes that we hope uplift your world. If you've been benefiting from the show, we'd also appreciate you hopping over to Patreon and making a donation. Brooke and I also see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website for more information on that. One last thing before we head into the conversation, just in case you're new to the show, is every once in a while, Brooke or I may curse. So if you're in mixed non-swearing company, you may want to pop in some headphones, just in case. Okay, everyone, here we go. Brooke.
Hello, Vanessa.
Here we are again.
Doing it again.
So today I want to initiate our conversation by speaking about something that, I don't know, it just kind of knitted together in my mind this week. It's not the first time I've thought about this in my life, but you haven't really heard about the book, The 5 Love Languages, right?
No, totally news to me, which apparently I'm the only one.
Yeah, I feel like you are. No, I don't know. But in the world of couples therapy, this book called The 5 Love Languages, which is by this guy, Gary Chapman, is quite well known. And the supposition is that we each have a way that we best experience being loved. And he says there's 5 different ways, according to his research. P.S. I never read the whole book. I've just heard about it from a lot of clients, and I've looked it up a little bit. And he says these ways are receiving gifts, quality time, words of affirmation, acts of service, and physical touch. So according to Gary Chapman, these are the 5 ways that we feel loved by people. And what popped into my mind was that that's really not any of those for me. So one of the things I was thinking of when it comes to connections in my life, the people I feel the most bonded with, like really genuinely bonded with. The people I go to when I'm struggling, the people I reach out to, that they all have one thing in common that I value a lot. And that is curiosity about me, interest. They ask me questions. They're present for answers. And there's no agenda to it. They just want to know about you. How are you? How was your day? What's on your mind? How are you doing with DNRS? Things like this. And I thought that's interesting. They don't talk about that as a love language. And I think we've probably all had the experience where we're meeting someone new either on a date or we're meeting someone new, like a new friend, and we sit down with them and they ask us nothing about ourselves. Have you had that experience?
I have.
Yes, I think we probably all have. And that's so unfamiliar to me as a person because I'm more accustomed to being the one asking questions. And when I sit down with someone and they ask no questions, I always find it fascinating. Like, what is happening here? Like there's this lack of curiosity. So as I was just pondering all of this, and I have some personal examples of why this feels relevant to me, but I started thinking about a retreat I took with Matt Kahn, I think last year, right around this time. And he was talking about how can you tell how conscious versus unconscious you are. And he gave 4 different points, but there was one that had just stood out to me that feels really relevant in this conversation, which was you can tell how conscious you are by how present you are. He said, though, the dilemma can often be presence is like a buzzword, and it's like, what does it really mean if you want to know, am I present or not? And he said, what you could look at is you could measure the activity of presence, which is interest in people, interest in what they're passionate about. I remember thinking at the time, Mario, my husband, loves sports. I don't care about sports at all. Never have had any interest. But it's his passion. And so I listen and I ask questions and I'm curious, right? And so what he described was there's this place where he said presence is the gift of interest. And a short attention span is showing someone who's been trained to be more interested in themselves than others. He said presence is equal interest in self and others. So there's a lot we can say about this because there's, I'm sure, many different ways people have been trained to be more interested in themselves than others. So it's not a judgment. It's more of a neutral statement, like, let's understand. But I thought it was really interesting to explore because I think for many people, cultivating the quality of presence, if we look at it in this way, of interest, is something that they're still maturing and deepening in over the course of their lifetime. And a lot of that comes from childhood wounding and dysfunctional models of love. But I thought it would be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, and it goes along with this sort of relational role that we've been on the last few weeks. I think starting with our conversation with Lynn Marie Lumiere and then examining these different aspects of how we connect in relationship. Again, for those who are just catching this one and not the others, whether that be our intimate love relationships or, parent to child, friendships, coworkers, any of the varietals of relationships. We even
had the relationship with ourselves, which can be very much modeled on what we learned in relationship and all those other places.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. We were talking about that a little beforehand. But so again, I'm not familiar with this love languages book. So I have no right to sort of bring it up, hold it as an example of any kind or trash it in any way, which is not my intent. But from hearing, what are these love languages? And then thinking back to our conversation with Lynn Marie, it seems very much that it's from an ego point of view, which is not the spiritual game of, oh, so they're the bad guys, right? Like only the ego does that. Oh, so they're the ones that are, dumb or aren't hip to what we're talking about. It's really that's what our culture does. Is it's an ego identified culture. That's what's shifting right now. So in all innocence and from that point of view, from a very informed place, right? It's like, let's clarify how different people's ego structures learned how to demonstrate and feel loved. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, that's really useful. Like if my love language were touch and I were partnered with somebody who wasn't a toucher except during sex, like I would feel very much like, hello, I can see how in any of those instances that would be very helpful.
And it gives you an easy way to talk about it.
Right?
Because
exactly.
then the therapist could say, well, her love language is touch and yours is this, but can you see how then she doesn't feel loved? So it has a really good functional usefulness.
Yeah, it's incredibly useful. So this isn't meant to be one of those disparaging conversations, but if we zoom out and get broader than the lens of the ego, as Lynn Marie so expertly did in our conversation with her, it's like, what's missing? And I would say what's missing is this ground of how we meet another. And presence is a great way to describe that. Interest takes it out of the spiritual woo-woo realm, so that can be very helpful. Curiosity, like curious about the other person, curious about even the dynamic maybe between you two. So the words are all going to evoke different things for different people, but we have to make sure that we bring this to the party when we're talking about relationships, because it's actually the really foundational and fundamental piece. And I wonder, in part, I feel like the reason why it doesn't get talked about is it seems so, on the one hand, obvious that it's like, well, yeah. And maybe people from, I'm just speculating here, but from different generations where there weren't so many screens involved in communication, maybe there was just a different pace of bonding. I don't know. And then on the other hand, I lost my train of thought. I'm like, I held that one for too long and I lost it. What was I talking about? On the one hand, is it so obvious? Is it so simple that we wouldn't bring it up? And then on the other hand, are we missing it because we're so focused on the small me, our little identities getting its need met? Because in my household growing up, I learned that someone only loves you if they spend quality time with you. And they absolutely don't if that's not their great joy, right? Like, what are we doing this Sunday is not their great joy. That must mean I'm not loved. But like you, Vanessa, I have found definitely, like when I think about, and I'm really lucky in my life, I have a lot of wonderful relationships. And when I think about what makes those feel safe, to harken back to last week's conversation, nourishing, enjoyable, pleasurable, and why I seek those people out just to spend time, or if I'm, in a tough place, it's because there's this spaciousness in the way that they relate to me, in the sense that there's room for me to exist, and there's presence, there's interest, because they're interested in how am I existing. And those two things coming together, space for me to exist. So we're not talking about like an invasive interest, right? What's going on with you? What's happening? Like, we're talking about
don't lie to me. Tell me more.
Exactly.
I know something's the matter.
We should spend every moment together. But like this spacious presence, which indicates to me that, like, it sounds silly, but to this person, I exist as an alive human being. I'm not an object to them. Whether that object be the fantasy, which could be anything. Brooke's the good listener. Brooke's such a bitch. It could be anything. But that makes me into this object. Or in the worst case scenario, like somebody who really never shows interest, is curious, never demonstrates that through any kind of very simple, like, how you been, or what's going on, or anything like that, I can feel like the kind of object that's being used, and the way I picture it in my mind is really like literally picking up like a vacuum and using the vacuum to vacuum the floor and then putting it back in the closet. Like there's just no attentiveness or reciprocity. There's nothing alive about that kind of connection.
I think presence is such an important quality because it's likely what many of us were missing. Even though, back then we could be with our families for hours on end, no iPhones to look at and distract us and things like that. So often people are wrapped up in their own bubble, wrapped up in their own thoughts, or even their nervous system is so dysregulated that they can't really be there with you. So it's really confusing because you could have a parent or a loved one or a family member who was physically there, but not necessarily present with you. I mean, when I went to school to study psychology, presence is obviously one of the big important topics. And you would talk about like, what would be the outcome if you were present? What would the client experience if you were present? And they would say they would feel felt. And it's something that we can all recognize when we feel felt by someone. Like really, like they're here, they're with me, they're mirroring me. And we can also feel when that's not there. And I think when we are raised in an environment where we don't receive a lot of presence, it can start to create our own nervous system dysregulation, our own unhealthy patterns around intimacy. And I think a lot of times we start to get the kind of wounds that sound like, I'm not heard, I'm not seen, I don't matter. They can start to have those types of themes. Now imagine one thing we can be aware of is that to the young child who's experiencing anything that the child is going through, they think, when I'm finally heard, I'll be happy. When I'm finally seen, I'll be happy. When I finally matter, I'll be happy. Right? When I'm finally in my own house and I'm not with these crazy people, I'll be happy, right? That's what the young person thinks. And I think it can become sort of like an unconscious agenda of love. Like, oh, when I finally get to be heard, so that when someone's in front of you who's available, you can talk and talk and talk. And that's how you feel connected. Because finally, here comes this moment, I'm being heard. I had a good friend this happened with years back, and the person was a practitioner themselves. So had spent most of their day listening to people, right? Being very present with clients. And then when they would get around me, would either talk about themselves and what they were struggling with consistently, or they would do a certain kind of energy work. They would like try to get me to do the energy work with them. So it's like, if it was about me, it was them trying to get me to do this energy work, but that's not what I was seeking. So it was still not about me, not in reality, but I'm sure that that person didn't realize that. And now this was a perfect lock and key for my pattern because I just am good at listening, and it's comfortable for me not to talk about myself to a certain extent, right? It's the place I learned to find harmony in my family life, and then in my adolescence as I was a little bit dysregulated sometimes. So lock and key, I would listen and listen and listen. They would talk and talk and talk until, of course, as these things always are the case, I burnt out on it. And I didn't want to really be around them. And they felt really close to me. And I didn't have that closeness with them. I kind of felt more of an acquaintanceship. They felt more of a close friendship. And when I started to look at it, I was like, well, of course, they've been really intimate and vulnerable with me. So they feel close. There's a bond that happens when we reveal ourselves and we allow ourselves to be held in our vulnerability. But because there wasn't this reciprocity, this flow, I didn't have that same bond with them. Now, this was a super well-meaning person, super loving person. And to other people in their life, they may have played a completely different role, right? Like I said, lock and key. But what I had said when it had finally come to the foreground, because it took me a while since I was historically conflict avoidant, was they were saying something about not feeling connected to people because people don't always get them. This person had quite a level of awakened wisdom, like consciousness level, oneness level wisdom, and people didn't get them and they didn't always get what they were talking about. And I said, well, have you ever tried just connecting through listening? And it had never occurred to them before that connection can be experienced in both ways. That as the listener, we can experience ourselves as really connected to them. And that is likely because of the dream of the ego. That was when I'm finally heard, I will finally get to experience the connection I'm so desperately craving in my life, right? Now, the sad part was, you and I have spoken on this show before about self-fulfilling prophecies. This person, in all innocence, based on their working model of love and their wounds, just wanted to be heard and had no idea that it wasn't creating a bond on my side, right? And in all innocence on my side, I had no idea how to articulate that because I was very well accustomed to being used as an object in my life.
Right.
In other ways, but hey, what's one more object role, right? That's how it felt.
Well, it feels familiar. Yeah. Right.
It felt pretty normal to me, really, like pretty normal. I didn't have a lot of awareness around that wound in myself at the time. But this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that we can all experience in so many ways is sad and it's painful because all the person wants is to be connected. And yet, if we don't understand how to connect, if we don't understand because we never saw a healthy connection, what it can look like when two people can sit and be present with each other, when two hearts can resonate and two brain waves can resonate and two lungs can sync up and the interest can be equally on myself and them. If we have never seen that modeled, then we often don't know how to do that. And then sometimes we wind up pushing people away or losing people in our lives simply out of not having this information.
Yeah, it's fascinating how it's like the fire that feeds itself, right? So if you imagine that a lot of us grow up in households where nobody's attuning to us, and because they're not attuning to themselves, and that might be worth getting into as well. Like, well, what makes a person not able to be present? And that's like the theme of the entire podcast. So it's not going to be shocking information, but it's not all the ideas that we have from ego land of like, they're such jerks, or they're so self-absorbed, or they're so broken, or whatever the thing is. It's like, they're consumed by something else than presence, which is usually the painful thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, but really the thoughts, like these kind of neurotic loops, the hypervigilant nervous system, the inability to track, find, and receive safety. That's what keeps a person busy and separate from being able to attune to others, being able to be in presence. It just keeps feeding itself. So we grow up in households with that, where there's people who they're busy with their own consuming ego fire, which is telling them how they screwed up, what they should do better at. They'll finally be able to relax at the end of the day if they do X, Y, or Z, whatever all the things are. And basically just not being able to receive the present moment, receive safety, notice anything that's going on other than the neurotic loop. And like, we all been there.
and still spend time there. So let's just make it normalize it, and not the people who are failing at the spiritual game or those less evolved people. This is describing the human experience.
Right.
Thus far. I have high hopes that we're evolving out of it, and nervous system evolution out of it. So if we grow up in that environment, we don't have anyone to connect to. There's like no receptor site, right? For beingness, for presence. And so as you were illustrating, it's like, finally one day, if I share enough, if I talk enough, if I
find the right person
who's a really good listener, and I just keep saying the things, doing the thing, everything from the me delivered to you perspective, spewing the stuff, then it will quench the thirst. Then I will feel like, I can just be here. And it's so sad, actually. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's painful. We all experience it. It's very painful. And it's also a little funny on the other side of it, because it's like the thing that was there, which is just like being able to receive another human being, just being able to behold their existence over lunch or whatever, is the nourishment. And not, if I give them these words, finally someone will hold them and receive them in the way that I want. So it's this little perspective shift that's so, it's not subtle, it's actually quite a big change, but so profound. And, it's one of the reasons why we get these annoying spiritualisms, like, it's just right here, right? Like you and I love to make fun of that one so much.
Right here.
It's just right here. It's all just right here. And like on a fundamental level, that's true, which is so hilarious. But if we can't receive safety, if we can't get enough space from our own neurotic selves or ego identified selves to notice that we're consumed by thoughts that aren't true, you shouldn't have mailed that letter 2 days late, can consume a person. It's like, well, I mailed it on the day I mailed it. It's already taken place. So that's how that went. Like, if we can't get enough distance to notice what's the fire in us, we can't actually land here, and go listen to last week's episode about receiving safety, because we talked about that a lot in a lot of detail already. But like, this is the rub. It's not finally someone will receive my important words that never got met or heard before.
Well, I suppose part of why this is so common is, in a way, if we were to be more global about it, we could say it's the difference between valuing doing versus being. And it could be doing is speaking and sharing important things about myself and vulnerable things about myself. Doing could also be like, I'm going to be the one telling the funny stories and entertaining people, and making sure everyone has a good time and that they're laughing, right? Doing is this activity versus being. And you really just described being. I mean, I remember one of the things I used to deal with is, if you were in a group of people, because this never really happened to me with just one other person, it was always like in a group, and the group fell silent, and I would be like, oh my God, like my anxiety would begin to build. And then I'd feel like I have to say something to direct the conversation some way or the other, And when I first started to realize that, like, wow, I have this real anxiety when it gets quiet, like it's A, as if silence is a problem. And B, then it's like, what, my job to make sure
to be the
harmony
hostess
is
of
reestablished.
Conversation. Right.
And so then for me to train myself out of it in the beginning, because I didn't have access to presence, I wasn't fully embodied, I started doing an experiment instead where if it got quiet, and I only did this like once a night, so don't think it's crazy, but I would just get up and go to the bathroom. And I would come back and I would see everybody took care of it.
Yeah, which is a great way to notice that and create space. Actually, I mean, it's amazing, right?
Yeah. And it was the beginning. It was like the way I could get in there to see and trust, like to begin to trust, okay, this will happen by itself. Not that I shouldn't speak. That's not what we're talking about. It was the anxiety and the agenda that would come in as if this was my role. And anything where we experience that kind of anxious, agendaed role, we know we're not really present. We know we're not just being. We are very actively doing. And if we're very actively doing, there's a really good chance we learned that somewhere in our past how to do it. And we may not want to be bringing it forward, right? So it was just the first thing where I could start to learn to soothe my anxiety. Like, this is okay, Vanessa. This works out okay. Everything reestablishes a rhythm. And honestly, don't even know where I got that anxiety from. Maybe I'll never know, right? I can't track it back to a single moment in time. I mean, I was speaking with a friend the other day, and they were telling me about a young child who was adopted. And when the child was very young, under 3, they were living with a mother in very difficult circumstances, and food was really hard for that child to come by. It used to have to like climb up to get food for themselves and feed themselves. So now, they're like 7 and they're not in that circumstance anymore. But every time they get around food, they take like 10 bags of it. I don't think that child probably even has a conscious memory of, oh, I'm doing this because food might get scarce, right? These patterns just get stored in us. That's the nervous system piece. That's the brain piece. That's the fascia and the cellular piece, is that somewhere these things are stored. And so the kindest intervention I could come up with was, okay, get up. Another way then, once I got past I have to go to the bathroom stage, I would just sit and take a breath or two and see what happened. Did anyone else jump in? Did the conversation right itself? And these are, the kinds of things we all face. So doing versus being is something I think a lot of us are very familiar with. And I just want to say one more thing about what you had said earlier, Brooke, about the state of the nervous system and the kinds of thoughts we were having. I remember we did an episode on the bubble of pain. And that's what I used to think, as if there was a bubble around my head that was like, do they like me? Am I doing the right thing? Am I safe? Is it okay? And I couldn't be present with anyone while that bubble was running. Right? So y'all can go back and listen to that if you haven't yet, and that's of any interest to you. But I like it when Neelam, who was on, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, pointed out that the capacity of the nervous system is predetermined. That's just such a loving way to look at it, and such an intelligent way to look at it. There's nothing I could have done to sit down at that table and be in a different space in that moment. That was predetermined by all of my life experiences. But once I observed, oh my gosh, I can't even tolerate silence without feeling like it's my job to do something or fix something or make something better, then I could start to say, what is this? And how might I work with this differently?
I'm having a memory about experiencing this from the opposite end, as a surprise, the bubble of pain popped. And then I experienced beingness by accident with one of my closest friends. She's like a sister to me. We've known each other since I was 14 years old, but that's exactly what happened. I had had an experience, and, for those who listen to the show, I had had a year where I had 3 really profound awakenings, and I had had the 3rd one on retreat, which just popped a lot of that bubble of pain. A lot of stuff fell away. And that's confusing if people have had big realizations. It's initially a little floating in outer space. I picture those sort of satellite spacewalk images where they're tethered to the ship, but they're kind of floating a little. It's just disconcerting. And I knew that right after this experience, which of course, nobody plans or expects for that to happen. Just is ta-da, giant big bubble pop, that I had some time scheduled to see her. Now, this is somebody who really genuinely is like a sister to me. And so she knows me through many different ages and stages and iterations and all of those things. And I'm thinking to myself, for some reason, because she was such a long-term friend, it's actually interesting, right? Because we can see that even though there was this big realization, there was also all of these egoic, spiritual ego ideas, right? About what that meant. Like, oh, and so that's going to mean that now I can't relate to people. Or now, like all those funny stories about enlightenment, which is not what I would call what happened to me, but like that after enlightenment, your life falls apart completely, or you're unrecognizable to the people in your life. And so there were all this confusion running in me of like, is that going to happen? Do I seem weird? Is this weird? It's totally coming from ego. That's not coming from the awakened state. The ego is like, what can I grab hold on to make a new identity out of? Ooh, I'm the confusing one who had the big realization. I'll do that one. Like, okay, got it. And so I'm in anticipation of this visit with her post big realization. The spiritual ego is telling me all these stories about it's going to be too much for me to handle. I'm going to feel really uncomfortable in my body. And there wasn't anything going on with this friend. This is literally just based on spiritual ego ideas of like, I'm different now. And so I go into the hangout with her. It was like spending a weekend with her because she lives in Massachusetts, so a couple states over. And my surprise of the weekend was that it was just like incredibly pleasurable from the level of just such sweet, unconditional love for this person. Like what actually happened was that I could see her from this whole other place. And I don't mean in like a creepy witness way. I mean like appreciate her. Love to hear anything that comes from ordinary human life, right? Like the spiritual ego talk. What's going on with her job? What's going on in her relationship? All the stuff you talk about when you get together with a friend. But my shock was discovering by accident, like, oh, when I'm really present, which is what happens, like when you have a big pain bubble pop, when you have a big realization, what emerges is the thing that was in the background the whole time, which is presence. It's just such sweet beingness with this person, which is automatically woven with an awful lot of love, affection, interest, like all those things that arise naturally with presence. And so for the first time, maybe in the history of this friendship, probably not, but maybe like I had a very, very deep, let's say, dive into being with her just from the point of view of presence. So I didn't have what am I going to complain about, right? This weekend? What's really bothering me? What am I really longing for or wishing was different? I didn't have any of those. That was what went away. And so what I had instead was like deep love, interest, and presence with this person. And it was this funny, like backwards way of discovering like, oh,
feels so good.
This is so nice and really easy. She doesn't need to give a shit about what just happened to me on retreat. Right. Be interested in spiritual things. I don't need to explain it or talk about it, nor do I feel the drive or desire or need to. I also don't feel the need to hide it like, ooh, my big, important, scary, amazing, wonderful thing. It was just like flow, right? And we use that word a lot around these parts, but like a delightful flow of being with. And it was funny to me at the time because it definitely was, I could see the humbling in it at the time. Like, oh, you have these narratives running of like, I'm so different now, or like now no one will be able to relate to me. And it's even especially more humbling, but in a very sweet way. So I don't mean that like on your knees humbled. I mean wondrous, like, oh, that's so awesome. Like we're just here to be with each other and to show up with one another and hold space and like, ta-da! Like that's the whole.
No, the sad joke is that love is so much more simple
It's the
than
easiest
the
thing.
practice can feel in reality.
Right.
Well, I mean, relationships are, they're often the place where we got wounds, and they're often the most complicated place, right? That's just kind of how it is. And one of our mentors early on had said to us that, to love and partnership, like the point of it, it's probably not how they said it, but just the words that are coming to my mind at the moment. But the point of it is to just marvel in awe and wonder and delight at the other person's existence. Oh, they're like this. Oh, it goes like that when they feel like that. Oh, look at this person. And that's such a spacious view. That was actually a big relief to me when they said that, because that was not the model of love I was presented.
No, nor were most of us.
That was not my parents were probably really big with the acts of service and the gifts. And those are great, actually. That makes me feel like I'm not alone in the world, I would say. Like when someone is willing to do something for you, I can feel less alone in the world. But it didn't necessarily create that gluey, sweet bond where it's like, wow, when I'm feeling really weak, you're the person I want to stand next to and like open my heart up with. But when I heard that person, our mentor, had said that to me, I was like, oh, yes, I'm loving this. And it's such a spacious definition, because it's like Matt had said something here. Let me see if I can find his quotes. Oh, he said, if people don't take an interest in like your spiritual path, then have something else for them to be interested in. Talk about something else. And he said, people don't have to be similar. They just have to be equally invested in coming together with interest in each other's passions. Mm-hmm. And I love that, because my husband's not a particularly spiritual guy. He certainly doesn't want to sit around and have spiritual conversations, put it that way, all of the time. And I still talk, and there's still things we share, but it doesn't really matter. He has full openness for it, full respect for it, full appreciation for it. And I with him and the things that he's super passionate about. So it gets like, oh, really spacious. Like we don't have to do anything but delight in the person's existence and allow them to delight in ours. But I thought we could bring in a couple of things, I don't know, like just to bounce around a little bit. Here's one. See what you think of this. So I was dating this guy a little while back, years back. And I remember having this conversation with him saying, you're not particularly curious. Like he was the type of person where, I don't know, let's say he came home and I looked like I was in a mood. I would say, oh, I had a tough day. And he wouldn't say anything. The conversation would just end unless I continued it, right? Now, I don't know if this is me being a woman. I don't know if this is me being a little introverted, comfortable in the role of listener. But the way I always have seen it is if someone's not curious, they're not ready for the information. Mm-hmm. That was always, and I liked Matt Kahn has a very similar view. So of course I'm like, he's right. But I don't know. I don't know. That's true. It's just my view. And so I said something to him like, you're not very curious. You're not very interested in me. And he said, well, if you have something you want to say, just talk up. He's like, that's how guys talk. Like, I just have something I want to say and then I say it, and then if you have something you want to say, like, just say it. And I was like, interesting. Now, I've thought about that a lot over the years, because I understood that even just like there could be different languages of love, there's different communication styles. And some of us may have been brought up in families or societal circumstances where asking isn't a big part of how communication goes. Sure. Communication may go, I tell you my story, you tell me your story. If you want to say something, say something. I'm always welcome to hear it, right? Mm-hmm. So I've thought about that a lot because I'm always willing to explore what my personal edge is. But I still keep coming back to, no, I really believe expressing some interest is what one does when they're really present with another person. But I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think so, because it's different, right? For sure, there can be that pattern, right, where somebody plays like they need to have the information drawn out of them and that's the other's job. Like, why didn't you draw out of me, why I was angrily shuffling papers, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. I was breathing really loud over
here. Right. I was storming around. Yeah, for sure. Like, and in situations like that, where there's that much energy behind something, it's like, yeah, speak up, say like, but in the example you gave, right? Like, I had kind of a tough day, for that to just fall. Like you hit the ball across the court and it just boom.
It's like thud. I know. That's how it feels energetically, right?
Yeah, it lands like a lead ball.
The ball you threw.
Right. And I think you're right. Like, there can be communication patterns in families where, especially because, like what we said, most of us didn't grow up with presence or attunement. And so I spout off stuff that you ignore, and then you spout off stuff that I ignore. For sure. It can be a common family pattern, but I don't think it's particularly useful. Like, there has to be some demonstrated interest.
Some feeling like we're in this engagement. I don't know. The whole thing's really interesting. I mean, the thing about relationships that's interesting in general, as we talk about two egos in relationship versus awakened relating, and I don't claim to have the number on awakened relating. But, just since Lynn Marie Lumiere had brought that into the conversation, it's interesting, is if we're going to talk about two egos in relationship, which is the condition most of us are in, egos always have an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Always.
Which is just helpful to hold, right? Like, baseline, always an agenda.
So squirrely and interesting, because you can have agendas to be the one who listens really well, as I was pointing out before. Like, that makes me feel safe. A lot of introverts love to listen. Like, I used to go to mixers, when you go to business networking events and go to a mixer, and I'm super awkward at those kinds of like large group of strangers things. And so inevitably, I'd wind up in a corner talking about someone's problems.
Yeah, no, I did that with so many like college parties. We're alone in a room, one-on-one, talking about that hard thing they're going through.
Yeah, now, until you get really aware, it can feel like, why is this always happening to me? But at a certain point, I knew why it was happening to me, at least, was because that was easier for me than small talk. So it was kind of my own agenda for feeling comfortable in a room or in a circumstance I wasn't comfortable in. We could have the agenda where we're going to be the one to ask a lot of questions. But I haven't had this experience, but people have told me about experiences where they're on a date and it feels like they're on an interview. Right?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
There's no spaciousness. Someone's asking questions, but you don't feel that like soft, present spaciousness where there's an actually like a live dynamic volley between two people like playing tennis going on. You feel like someone's drilling at you and they have more of an agenda to find things out or to be the interested one.
Yeah, or to deflect from having to say anything about themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. To deflect from
keep
being
them busy.
vulnerable.
Keep asking questions. That way I don't have to say anything vulnerable or at all about myself.
Yeah. You do the vulnerable thing. I won't do the vulnerable thing.
Right. Exactly. Go team. Great conversation.
The other thing, I've said this on the show before that I found really helpful was, and I don't even remember what motivated me to do this, but it was back when I was in grad school. So surely we were talking about presence and listening and things like that. And I had noticed that if I stayed embodied or at least aware of my body while I was speaking, I could see when I was in an agenda. I could experience when I was in some kind of a pattern versus really present with. So I would allow my awareness to be on my belly. At that time, I was studying with John Wellwood, and I used to call the belly the bullshit meter because John would talk about how truth can be found in the belly. And so I would that's probably what gave me the experiment idea. I would allow my awareness to be resting on my belly, and then I would talk. And I would notice you lose your belly when you're going off into one of your things. Totally. The funny one, the entertaining one.
Or even into them, right? Like,
yeah,
totally in them. Yeah.
Yeah. I would lose awareness of my belly. And so I'd say, what am I talking about right now? I'm just like spouting nonsense. Mm-hmm. And so I would bring my awareness back and I would try to speak again. And I did about a week of it. And that gave me a lot of clarity into how often my communication was not infused with actual presence, but was just a string of words and actions slung together by some, in reality, karmic momentum from the past, probably.
Yeah, habit, something that's playing out. Location-wise, I really love the back of the heart too, and that comes from, working with John Prendergast. He's so good at that. How do we land in the heart?
He taught a class called The Art of Listening at CIIS.
Well, there you have it.
That was his whole thing.
Yeah, and I've found that location because for those listening who like to play with embodiment stuff, if you feel into the front of the heart, it has, and especially people who listen to this kind of show, empathic types, those of us who tend to operate more in like healer type work or relationship arrangements. Arrangements makes it sound so tawdry. You know what I mean? Setups, habits. The front of the heart has a little bit more of that, like what we think of as the heart, as the emotion center, like energy spilling out, giving, pouring that into the world. Are you generous? Are you the good one? Are you nice enough? But if we settle towards the back of the heart, and I don't mean on the skin of the back, I mean kind of right directly in front of the spine. It's inside the body, like as Judith Blackstone so beautifully teaches about landing in the body. And it is at what I continue to find this very powerful energetic center. Like there's a reason why we talk about the heart center and all these other energy centers. But at the back, it's like I'm in myself, I'm in a spacious presence, and I'm in this place of tenderness and affection, but it doesn't have that like, am I giving enough? How are they perceiving me? Are they perceiving me as nice kind of stuff?
Or I'm all up in their business.
Yeah, or that kind of meshy, little bit invasive, what's going on with them? Or how can I make them feel better? Or any of those things. It has both of those qualities of interest and being with, and also spaciousness and being in my own body. So that can be a really fun location to play with too, as experiments go, of when you're talking with someone.
I feel like I'm having a flashback that maybe at one point we did a whole episode on listening.
Probably. We probably said all of this before. Not really. We just never remember what we actually talk about.
I think we did have an episode on listening because I remember saying at the time, so if not, doesn't matter, I'm saying it again, that the good news is that this is all, it's reasonable to think of it all as a skill.
Yeah.
And sure, if my nervous system's completely dysregulated, I'm not going to be that present and I'm not going to be listening well. So sometimes that has to do with my past and my patterning. Sometimes that has to do with the person I'm around is not someone I'm meant to be listening to.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can keep that all in mind.
Basic things, like if you have the flu, you're not going to be the most present. You're not going to be tip-top. Get over the flu.
You're not.
Go back to your relational life after.
Yeah, and P.S., if you're not in a space to listen, then try not to be in the space to listen.
Yeah.
Try to say, I can't talk right now. Don't pick up a phone call. Don't ask a lot of questions if you can't listen, because it's better not to ask than it is to fake listen to somebody who might be opening up vulnerably, right? So it's okay. Like, you don't have to be present all of the time with people. You definitely don't have to listen to people all of the time. This is all like an art form and a subtle self-exploration with a lot of nuances. But communication is something we acquire. I mean, we learn skills of communication. And so if we all just reflect back on what our models were around communication, a lot of us may not have learned being present in communication. And listening, how to listen, how to be curious. We may not have learned that. And the good news is that on one level, we can think of it as a skill. So if we start to reflect, just like I did when I was in the restaurant, or just like you're describing when you sit in the back of your heart, Brooke, like if we start to reflect, like, you know what? I think that there's some truth in this for me. Well, we can just practice the simple skill of sitting and breathing more while we're in conversation with people.
Yeah.
That is a tremendous way to become present. I mean, the breath is like the most simple, underrated tool in the world, probably.
Yeah.
Because at the same time as you're saying, just breathe more, Vanessa, breathe and just be here with them. What you're doing is you're becoming conscious. You are regulating your nervous system. You are slowing down, right? All of these things at once. And you'll be able, therefore, to receive them more. So I feel like when all else fails, if we have social anxiety, because that's something that can make it very hard to listen to people, right? The anxious thoughts in our mind and the way our body is revving, or even if we don't feel comfortable sharing about ourselves. Let's say we're on the opposite side of the spectrum. We are very good at listening, but we're not so great at expressing. Whatever side of the spectrum we're on, we can try to like feel our feet on the floor and take some breaths. And then go for whatever your edge is. Listen more, ask more if that's your edge. Oh my God, but will they ever hear me? Will we run out of time? How sweet, how innocent. There's a young one in there that's really scared, an inner child that's scared. But you can breathe and say, it's okay, we're okay. Or if you're saying, will they receive me if I share something that's a little tender? Breathe, talk and breathe and see what happens. It's a tremendous place to begin from.
And I just want to mention before we end the episode, because there's Amy Matthews, who I interviewed on Liberated Body, but she's somebody who's doing really good work popping the cultural bubble around this in something called the Babies Project. So that interview is there. I'm not going to go off on a big tangent, but there's a lot of working with new parents, with infants. And it's really a lot of teaching them how to be with their infant. And the surprise that she mentioned people always have is like, well, shouldn't I be like doing something? Should I be showing them colored books? Should I be like, what should I be doing? And she's always teaching them like being with them, really attuning to them, and then letting them have their own autonomy and their own authority of, in this case, movement, is such a beautiful relationship builder at that stage. It's such a beautiful attunement, and it really grows from there, because you learn like, oh, look at them, like we were describing in this great example of relationship, like look at them doing their thing. Like, I'm not the one forming those hip joints as they rock back and forth on all fours. I'm not the one going from, being on my tummy to sitting upright. Like, look at you go. Like, it has this, you're with them in it. You're connected. You're being with them. Because you're the parent in this case, you're of course excited for them, but like, it's not for you to do. So you just behold it with quite a lot of presence. And it's so funny. It's just, this is really powerful stuff. So her project I'll link to in the show notes, because it's really good stuff.
Oh, yes. And to wrap it up from what you were just saying, if any of this becomes now like a new way to judge yourself or analyze yourself.
Yes, the ego got its little sticky fingers
on it. Am I present enough? Am I listening enough? Like, oh my God, am I a shitty person? Are they talking about me? Whatever.
Am I fire hosing at them again? Yeah.
Whatever the case may be, then that's the opportunity to practice bringing this kind of presence and listening and being and love to yourself, because that's where it starts, right? This is, again, all in innocence. We all just want to be happy, connected, loved, and loving. And so anytime something is disharmonious in those areas, it is completely innocent. It means that's what we were taught, or that's how we were conditioned. But luckily, we have consciousness and the power to transform. It is just always going to happen through love.
Mm-hmm. And presence feels good. It feels like love. So it doesn't feel like something you need to hold onto or do the right way. It's evoked and it feels good. It feels very natural.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any and all of the resources we mentioned in this episode, live at blissandgrit.com. Head over to the website and you'll see each episode's separate post. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. This is where you can go to donate to the show and also to get rewards for your support. So if you've been wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, it's a great place to go for a more immersive experience. We'd love it if you'd come play with us on social media. We're most active on Instagram and Facebook. Or subscribe on the website. Again, it's blissandgrit.com if you want to get our weekly digest or find out more about our private practices. We are so grateful to each and every one of you who have taken the time to write us reviews, to send us notes or comment on social media, and most especially for the membership support so many of you have provided us. We couldn't do this all without each and every one of you. Thank you. And next week, please note, we will be having a throwback episode because we'll be traveling for the holidays. So stay tuned to catch up on some old-timey goodness. Okay, everyone, till next week.